In 2022, Ireland was ranked the third richest country in the world, behind only Luxembourg and Norway. GDP per capita is 50% higher than the UK, and since 2001, Ireland has had one of the fastest rates of economic growth in the developed world. But the important question is, do people living in Ireland really feel this well off? Is wealth trickling down? Ironically, for such a theoretically rich country, many young people are struggling to meet basic cost of living. Homelessness is rising, and housing costs eat into disposable income. It's causing the young people to consider emigrating.
Now, 7 in 10 young Irish people are planning to emigrate because of the cost of living crisis.
The transformation of the Irish economy from the sick man of Europe in the 1970s is a story of genuine transformation. But why can't more people benefit from these impressive growth figures? We'll look at the problems facing the real Irish economy, why GDP can be misleading, and why more people haven't benefited from the economic growth of recent years. The strong growth in the Irish economy has unfortunately come at the cost of significantly higher cost of living pressures. Eurostat report that Ireland has become the third most expensive country to live in, behind only Switzerland and Iceland. Average wages have risen, but it's little comfort if 50% of your wage goes on basic living costs. Since 2015, house prices have risen 50% faster than earnings. Renting has increased even more. Since 2015, rents in the Greater Dublin area have doubled, leading to rents of over €1,500, at least €2,000 in Dublin itself. I recently asked a friend from Dublin what he thought about GDP rankings, and he replied, "Well, now it's all very well, but it doesn't help me to pay my rent." GDP doesn't mean much to people when you're faced with such high living costs. Now, although it is a pan-European problem, high costs of housing, it's definitely more acute in Ireland, with rents rising faster than the European average. It reflects a chronic shortage of housing compared to soaring demand. Since the great financial crisis around 2007, there's been a consistent failure to build new housing in sufficient numbers to meet the growth in the population. Ireland's population has soared from 3.5 million to 5.3 million in the past 23 years. Yet the number of new houses that have been built has lagged behind. Ireland has one of the lowest ratios of dwellings per inhabitant. This is due to complex planning procedures, burdensome regulations which limit the building of housing where they're most needed. Ireland has also one of the lowest ratios of a population living in purpose-built high-density apartments, reflecting cultural preferences but also regulations on height, especially in Dublin. The government have targeted building 33,000 new houses per year, but the actual numbers built have fallen behind this level quite a lot. The Irish housing crisis has not been helped by recent inflation, which has seen construction costs rise 30%, combined with a shortage of skilled labour in construction. A large driver of population growth in recent years has been from immigration, not so much from within the EU, but from outside the EU. We will explain why this is soon, but in terms of the housing market, it's pushed up rents beyond what most people can afford. As a share of income, Ireland is one of the most expensive places to live, with no end in sight to the housing crisis. But it's not just housing costs which are a problem. Ireland faces uniquely high living costs in Europe. Medical costs are 92% higher than the EU average. Pressures on the healthcare system have led to longer waiting lists. Doctors are under immense pressure to work long hours, causing some to give up on expensive Ireland and move to places like Australia, with shorter working hours and cheaper housing. The shortage of staff in the healthcare system is one reason for the migration of workers from outside the EU. They are needed to fill many vacancies. Also, another very important picture to the puzzle is that whilst there are definite cost of living pressures, GDP statistics can be very misleading, even useless for the average Irish citizen. One important factor behind Ireland's recent economic growth has been their success in enticing foreign multinational companies, around 75% of which are American, tech giants like IBM and later Microsoft, Apple and Google. Ireland was able to offer a few advantages: a tax-free zone around Shannon Airport, strong cultural and language links with America, but more than anything, it was an effective corporation tax of around 3%. This encouraged a surge of foreign direct investment. By the end of 2021, the stock of foreign direct investment in Ireland was around 1.2 trillion euros, more than 4 times the EU average. This had the effect of both boosting the real economy, which we'll explain soon, but also it created a massive statistical distortion, which makes GDP an unreliable measure. Gross domestic product measures total output produced in a country. Because of a very low corporation tax in Ireland, multinationals want to pretend their production takes place in Ireland rather than America. If you take an iPhone, it says designed in California, built in China. But for tax purposes, the intellectual property was made in Ireland. Apple executives once went to Congress to explain how they can make profit in Ireland rather than the US, and this enables them to pay virtually no corporation tax. Ireland benefits because they get a small share of a very large pie. Apple are happy because they avoid tax. Now, the Irish government itself admits that GDP is particularly unreliable, and they prefer another measure of economic growth called gross national income, and this excludes tax avoidance schemes and selling of intellectual copyright and things like that. Irish GNI is around 20% lower than GDP and is a much better guide to what's actually produced here. But the interesting thing is that even if we use GNI, Ireland still comes out very well. It's now the 4th richest economy in the world per capita rather than 3rd. And this is still a radical transformation from a post-war period. The investment of foreign multinationals hasn't just created statistical distortion. It also created real economic growth. It created highly paid jobs in tech and industry. The inward investment benefited the whole economy, and this is seen in an impressive growth in real wages in recent years. So if we've had this kind of economic miracle, how come there's still so much economic dissatisfaction? Inequality in Ireland is relatively low compared to, say, the UK and the rest of Europe, but still 40% of income is held by the richest 10% of workers. Skilled workers and highly educated have particularly benefited from the new high-tech economy in pharmaceuticals and IT. But the poorest 20% haven't benefited from this new economy. The poorest 20% rely on government benefits, which make up around 70% of their income. After the financial crisis, the IMF offered Ireland a bailout on the condition corporation tax was increased closer to international levels. But the Irish government didn't want to give up on this competitive advantage. They pursued their own fiscal austerity. And to be fair, they've been one of the most successful countries in bouncing back from a financial crisis. But it was at the cost of a 9-year freeze on minimum wages and squeezing the social security net to make austerity savings. Low-income groups have been particularly vulnerable to recent rises in housing costs and energy. A household spending $2,000 a year on energy in 2020 saw that surge to $4,000 a year in 2022. If you include all the different costs of living pressures, the Irish Times calculate the average household will be spending an extra €7,500 per year in 2024 compared to 2021. Since the financial crisis of 2008, the Irish government have veered towards a fiscal conservatism. Net debt to GDP looks relatively low by international standards, though we do have to bear in mind because GDP is distorted, it's worse than it looks. Also common with many other countries, the new high-tech economy, focused around the Greater Dublin area, has created a dual economy between Dublin and more rural areas, which traditionally relied on agriculture and fishing. Now, as a share of GDP, agriculture and fishing is now only 1%, a tiny fraction of what it used to be. But this is misleading because of, firstly, GDP's distortionary effect, but also For local economies, and as a share of employment, the agriculture and fishing still remain important parts of the economy, even if their contribution to GDP is relatively small. But these parts of the economy haven't seen the same growth that higher tech and industrial sectors have. The transformation of the Irish economy in the post-war period has had very real benefits: growth in employment, growth in wages, and higher tax revenues for the government. Employment opportunities have increased, and even if we ignore the distortionary effects of tax avoidance schemes, real wages have risen. Yet for many Irish workers, they don't see the full benefits of this economic growth. The high GDP stats are like a mirage. It's no good having a high GNI if you spend 50% of your income on basic housing costs. Like the rest of Europe, Ireland faces another challenge in the coming years: a declining birth rate and falling population. Now, whilst that may help the housing crisis in the long term, it will have very significant economic effects. This video on Europe's population decline goes into more details on how countries like Ireland will be affected. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and see you soon.